Let me just point out that in the order in which I will invite them to speak, I have to my left Mr. Munib Masri, who is a Palestinian with experience from at least 3 Levantine countries. And what I will ask Mr. Masri to tell us about, which he may or may not react to, I'm just a moderator, is how the Arab Spring may have affected Palestine, and I wonder myself whether it has affected Hamas in any way, on the one hand, and probably more importantly, how has it affected the Arab-Israeli relations. I would then ask Mr. Efraim Halevy, second to my right, who has forgotten more about Israel than most people will ever know, to give us to tackle the same question from the Israeli point of view: how has the Arab Spring affected the relationship? To my immediate right is Nada Dhaif, and you have many of you have heard her this morning. You know that she is absolutely brilliant. She's being worked as a horse at this forum, having spoken this morning, speaking now. Then she's got another panel right after this one. I even think that it's in the same room. She has been Nada, as you will have read, has been a very active person in the developments in Bahrain, to the point that she has incurred the wrath of the authorities, has been tormented, tortured, arrested, all these kinds of awful things that can happen to people who find themselves putting their own personal welfare and fate in charge of winning some changes. And what we will be interested in is perhaps for Nada to give us a thumbnail sketch of what Bahrain is all about. It's probably one of the lesser-known countries in Prague, and reflect perhaps what I wonder about is why has the Arab Spring, however much it has tried, hasn't affected major or fundamental changes in any of the monarchies in the Middle East, and what perhaps the Saudi intervention in Bahrain, what role that may have played. Then, to my extreme right, I will ask Professor Suat KINIKLIOÐLU to reflect for us on Turkish role, which started out immediately after the Arab Spring erupted as being very energetic, I would say, with the Prime Minister visiting several of the countries, trying to put Turkey in a to demonstrate Turkey as a possible role model for particularly Egypt at the time and so forth. Has it petered out? Has it gone wrong? Has Turkey's domestic troubles overshadowed its regional efforts, or what has happened? And then last to speak will be my old friend Hynek Kmoníček, who is a great expert on the Middle East. And amazingly, and this must be due to the vicissitudes, the political vicissitudes of Czech foreign policy mechanisms, he has managed never to serve there. Don't bother explaining that one. But I will invite Hynek to comment on all the remarks that he will have heard and give us a preview of what he will be advising the President concerning the Middle East. So without further ado, let me ask Mr. Munib Masri to take the floor. And I'll even give him the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Kovanda. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'd like to thank the organizers of Forum 2000 for their kind invitation. I'm honored to be here with this great panelist here that they represent a good chunk, important chunk of the world. Yes, the Arab Spring has affected us in many ways, but my presentation to you will go from up to bottom, if you don't mind. I will tell you what we feel in our part of the world. In 5 minutes, in 4 minutes. Much of what lies behind the Arab uprising across the region, or what's called the Arab Spring, can be linked to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which has been festering for almost 65 years. For the past decades, my country, Palestine, has only seen conflict, occupation, displacements, and tragedy. Palestinians and Israelis have been consumed in a decade-old conflict, with Palestinians bearing the brunt of daily hardships and Israel finding itself in the position of occupier, which it cannot continue to justify, neither morally, nor strategically, nor legally, to itself, let alone to the outside world. Decades-old wrongs are being addressed throughout the region with varying results. But what is certain is that oppression and injustice are not sustainable. All of us, whether political leaders or everybody, citizens like me, who've been working on this conflict for 45 years to find a peaceful way of living together in harmony with the Israelis, have a chance to be on the right side of history and participate in bringing about a change today. 1 year ago, exactly to this date, in Istanbul at the World Economic Forum event, a group of 10 Palestinians and Israelis, business persons and members of civil society came together to launch an initiative which they named Breaking the Impasse. Under the initiative of Breaking the Impasse, business leaders from both sides, responsible for over 30% of the GDP of Palestine and Israel, decided to take a collective stand and upset the status quo, to challenge the sense of complacency, to urge our leaders to act decisively. We have come together as responsible civic leaders to say in one clear voice, enough is enough. Break the impasse, halt measures and erode the hope of the two-state solution, enter into a determined political process, and we shall support you and contribute in any way we can. As Palestinians, we rejected the status quo, and we will not engage in any normalization under occupation. This is an ethical commitment we made as responsible leaders in both sides for this initiative. We will not entertain joint economic or commercial schemes that would legitimize the status quo or illegal occupation. As responsible leaders, if we do not seize today, then we have only ourselves to blame for falling into an abyss of eternal conflict, apartheid, and loss of hope. Breaking the Impasse initiatives call on leaders to heed and lead their people to better future and the continuous expansion of settlements, tear down this terrible wall, and elevate the resolution of this conflict to an existentially priority. The broad outlines of any resolution are clear and documented in the UN resolution and the roadmap, and we are known by the interested parties. Borders along 1967 lines, Jerusalem as a capital of the two states, Israel and Palestine, a just solution to the plight of our refugees based on UN Resolution 194, and the release of all political prisoners. These are not new ideas. The late President Arafat accepted this painful compromise on behalf of the Palestinians for a state on 22% of our historic homeland and called it the peace of the brave. Our current president, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, is continuing along this path of peace and has been a trusted and dedicated partner waiting to be joined at the table. The Arab Peace Initiative, endorsed by 57 Arab and Islamic countries, also adopted this position and offered a historic strategic vision for peace in our region once the Palestinians achieve self-determination. We are keen to show the world what Palestinians can do when freed from the shackles of occupation and what regional responsibilities lies ahead for Israel as a contributor to peace, technology, science, and human development in the new post-Arab Spring Middle East that would embrace instead of boycott it. I thank you, and I will be happy to answer any questions. And as you see, I'm glad that we have broke the impasse the Israelis and Palestinians are talking to each other, thanks to the administration of the United States, who's putting the two sides together. And we hope in the next 6 months or 7 months, we're going to have a settlement. The whole world is waiting for the settlement. And I think the Arab Spring and the nations of the Arab Springs will be very happy to accept and love the state of Israel when this thing happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Munib Masri. You reminded us about the Break the Impasse initiative, which is about a year old, in which both Palestinian and Israeli personages agreed that settlement should be based on the borders, on Jerusalem, on refugees, and on release of prisoners. You ended up with an anticipation that, I quote, Israel will be a contributor to peace. And so it is with these last words of you that we have a good bridge over to Efraim Halevy.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege and an honor for me to be here this afternoon, and I want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. This is not my first visit to Prague. I first came here in 1956. I was the leader of the National Union of Israeli Students. I came here as the head of my organization to attend a meeting of the International Union of Students, which was then the front organization, international organization of the student community of the communist world. And I came here, and within a very short time, a confrontation developed between myself and the first time that the General Union of Palestinian Students ever came to a conference. And that was here in 1956. And in a short presentation I made, I said that we extend our hand to our Palestinian friends and invite them to come and make a peace with us. And the head of the Palestinian delegation got up and made a very fiery speech in which he rejected the right of Israel to exist and said that the Palestinian cause would not be consummated until the government of Israel was removed and the state of Israel come to an end. And the head of the Palestinian delegation was Yasser Arafat. It has taken a long time, ladies and gentlemen, from those days in 1956, when this conference was held here, by the way, under the chairmanship of a great Czech leader, subsequently played a role, Jiří Pelikan, whose name I think is known in this city, who then went on to be on the side of Mr. Dubček in 1968. It takes a long time to effect these changes, and the change in the Palestinian position concerning Israel only began to take fruit in the 80s, over 30 years after that meeting here in Prague. And only in 1992-93 did we begin what was called the Oslo process. And as Mr. Al-Masri rightly stated, there is at present a series of negotiations going on between Israel and the Palestinians. And there are secret negotiations, they're supposed to be secret negotiations, and the content of the negotiations is unknown. I think we should focus to the future and not to the past. But the subject of our discussion this afternoon, if I believe, is, amongst other things, the Arab Spring, if I'm not mistaken.
You're not mistaken.
I'm not mistaken. And I think one of the things which has been remarkable as far as the Arab Spring is concerned is that its attention to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been minimal, and that is an exaggeration. The issues of the Arab Spring, the demands for liberty and dignity, that was I think the demand, the basic demand of the peoples in Tunisia when it began, and as it blew over to Cairo, and the masses that came to Tahrir Square were demanding liberty, freedom, and dignity. And as we look around, what is happening in the last couple of years, the terrible torment in the countries around us, around Israel, has little or nothing to do with Israel itself. And the Israeli-Palestinian issue, although it is an important issue, is no longer a core conflict, as it was often called. It's one of several conflicts, and maybe not the most important conflict at the moment on the agenda of the international community or the agenda of the Middle East community. Now, as far as the Arab Spring is concerned, I think this is a highly interesting and important development in the Arab world and the countries of the Middle East. It has affected countries in different countries in different ways. We saw what happened in Tunisia, we saw what happened in Egypt, but we're also seeing what has happened in Syria, when there was an attempt to repeat, to some extent, what went on in Egypt. And I would like to remind you that in the year 2009, when there were elections in Iran, and when a group of people tried to oppose the leadership, the elections were rigged, and the president of Iran was elected in a rigged election. And now, just a couple of months ago in the elections in Iran, there was a change, and the elections seemed to have been genuine elections, and the president who was elected was someone who was known from the past, but is speaking differently in the present. So there are many colors in the spring which is now engulfing the Middle East. I think it is to the credit of many people in the Middle East that they are standing up for their rights, and standing up for liberty, standing up for justice, and standing up, above all, for dignity for all peoples in the Middle East, so all of them can live side by side in mutual recognition and mutual acceptance in a way which would be a message to the world that ultimately these kind of conflicts can be settled because there are more issues, more important issues on the table, such as finding water and food for the burgeoning populations of the Middle East, the doubling of the population in Egypt up to 90 million, the doubling of the population in Iran up to 90 million, and the many others who now have to be taken care of if the countries and the peoples of the Middle East are to survive in a proper manner. So there are many, many issues which have to be tackled, economic, social, and political issues, and issues related to other matters such as terrorism and the way terrorism has taken hold in several of the countries around us. But all these are important issues which have to be tackled, each in its own right. And I hope, amongst other things, the Palestinian conflict will also get the real attention and the adequate attention which it should deservedly receive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Efraim Halevy. I enjoyed your flashback to 1956 and to Jiří Pelikan's times. You said that the effect, if I understood you correctly, the effect of the Arab Spring on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been minimal, and yet all kinds of things have been happening, probably outside the framework of the Arab Spring. And you said that the conflict may, at this moment, given everything else that's happening, may not even be the most important conflict in the Middle East. Did I understand that correctly? And then you drew our attention to some of the other issues that are going on: the scarcity of food, the scarcity of water, the doubling of the population here and there. I think you drew in the recent Iranian presidential elections as, my words, an echo or a part of the Arab Spring. So lots of topics that you threw up, and I'm quite sure that there's going to be a number of questions which might want to explore some of these topics furthermore. Nada Dhaif. If I may say, little countries, I've gotten into trouble for calling a country little in my diplomatic career. Sorry? It is. Well, I'm glad I'm not getting into conflict here. Tell us a bit about what's happening back home. what's happening back home, and how does it relate to the rest of the Arab world?
Right, briefly, Bahrain is really, really a small country. Like, it's the second smallest after the Vatican. However, the population is about 500,000, so you can imagine how small my country is. This is the population, about 1 million, but the rest are expats. The majority, the natives of Bahrain, happens to be Shia, and, well, we're born like that. But the area, which is like one bigger country, which is one state, the Gulf countries, the GCC, you have Saudi, Kuwait, Qatar, Emirates, the majority are Sunni. So we're just that small dot, and all these people surrounding us. Of course, bear in mind, we have our big neighbor, Iran, and Iraq, which is also a majority Shia. Is the conflict, is Shia Sunni thing? Well, no. No, it's about dignity, it's about rights, it's about freedom, it's about democracy, period, end of the line. But why didn't we hear of a king that hasn't fallen yet? I'll give you the good news. It's going to happen. All of them. Unless they take the only exit for any king to survive is to take the constitutional monarchy or the Westminster's example. Otherwise, it's just a matter of time. And who thinks, actually, of Mubarak is not a king, or Ben Ali, or it's the same story, and it's the same phenomena, and it's the same, all under different titles, but it's all in the Middle East. In general, it's like a big monarchy. And where do they get their legitimacy? We have two scenarios. Of course, we have the bigger scenario, which I'll leave it to the last. The first scenario, which is these are the descendants of Prophet Muhammad, like in Morocco and in Jordan. But however, I'll give a little bit of credit to Morocco. They were a bit smarter when the whole uprising thing started in the Middle East, and they give a little bit of space and freedom, which is kind of settled, but not for long. Let's look at the bigger picture, where the rest of the monarchies, they get their legitimacy and power, and they seem to be really, really solid. But in fact, they're really fragile from the inside, and that comes from the support that get internationally. For a while, the two axes of powers, one of the axes of powers was really, really dominant, which is like the United States and Britain and Israel in part of it, but mainly United States. And the other axis, which is Russia, which is now uprising, like Russia, China, Iran, and this part. And this conflict is more or less, has a much bigger picture than reality. Well, that leads us to, am I out of time? Tell me when I run out of time. Right, are you looking at me?
Listen, carry on.
Okay. Okay, so the challenge is here, that this transition is going really fast. But to be fair, it's like a very hard labor for the Middle East. But some countries, their transition already reached to the fetus stage. And I'll give it an example way, like a fetus and babies, and so you see, because there's a zillion ideas in my head, and I just want to explain it to you. It's kind of not very known to many of you. However, the challenge of transition in our area is not meant to happen, and this baby is not meant to grow strong, because in case if this fetus grows strong and stands up, it will change lots of things in the world. By that time, it grows stronger and decides to which side to ally with. That is like throwing the bullet of mercy to the other side. So I know that the international, which is like, let's say, whoever is deciding, whoever keeping the kings and monarchies in our area, they will do their best to suppress the uprising. But the genie is out of the bottle anyways. And all what we need to think of is what's the best way for this fetus to grow in a healthy way. The only message that it's here, time is ending. Occupation era is over. Trying to dominate people's lives and lands and decisions, and it's all over. It's time to let people choose and to take the right side of the history. About Europe, Europe is really busy with their own issues here. Really?
Yeah, let's leave Europe aside. Let's leave it for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nada. You reminded us that the majority of the people in the small country of Bahrain are Shias, whereas in the general peninsula and the GCC countries, the majority of people are Sunnis, but that you have two great Shia neighbors just across the Strait of Hormuz, is it, or something, just across the water in Iraq and Iran. But then you made the very important point that the friction in Bahrain is not sectarian but democratic, which is a point that not everybody would necessarily understand. And you talked about some of the sources of legitimacy of monarchies or of regimes in general, and some monarchies derive their ancestries back to the Prophet, and others, if not everybody else, rely on international support. And that's where the fragility of the apparently strong countries come from. So the babies are not supposed to grow strong, the genie is out of the bottle, right? One country that has been looking over at the baby and looking at the genie has been Turkey, where many of us will recall the Turkish Prime Minister traveled the newly democratizing countries of Egypt and Tunisia, etc., in what to my mind was an effort to demonstrate that Turkey as a model of a secular Muslim country. But Suat may have his own take on this, and could you tell us what happened to the Turkish pretensions, is that the right word, efforts to demonstrate regional leadership, and where has it gone?
I admire your diplomacy, Karel. I think the Czech payers' tax money is being well spent while you were in the foreign ministry. Well, let me give you a Turkish perspective, one Turkish perspective. There are many Turkish perspectives, but one Turkish perspective of what has happened over the last 2.5 years. First of all, indeed, when the events in Tunisia started, with a little hesitation at the beginning of the Libya operation, Turkey understood that it has to be on board. It supported the NATO operation. The Libya operation, I guess, was relatively short and successful, at least for its objective to get rid of the Gaddafi regime, but not to mention the aftermath, whose impact we're all and probably will be increasingly experiencing over the coming months and years. Prime Minister Erdogan was one of the first leaders to call for Mubarak to go when it was unclear how the events in Tahrir Square would, which direction they would turn. And I think by the end, once Mubarak was gone, Turkish foreign policy looked pretty good in terms of siding with the revolutionaries or the changing forces, whatever you want to call them, those who wanted to get rid of dictatorship or the current orders that had been running those places for a long time. When Syria started, there was including myself, I have to admit, we all thought that there was a wave of events occurring where Syria would not be immune from. We all perceived that this wave would be irresistible for President Assad and the Ba'ath regime, and that this eventually would carry this regime out of there. But as you know, over the last 2.5 years, what has happened has clearly shown that Syria has been a different story, and the reasons for that are very clear. In Tunisia, in Egypt, the main state factors, namely the military and the bureaucracy, decided to side with the change forces or the revolutionaries, and that's how Ben Ali and Mubarak had to leave. In Libya, there was no state. That was a whole different game. There was a foreign intervention, a legal one, through the United Nations Security Council in 1973, and that was fine. But in Syria, the military, the intelligence apparatus, enforced by the sectarian identity issue and also the threat of a long-time dictatorship that is on paper a minority, decided to side and stay with the president. What was also could not be foreseen, the strict resistance of Russia and China in the Security Council, and of course the physical intervention on the ground by Hezbollah and Iran. By the way, it's really hot here. If the organizers could maybe get some air conditioning out, that would be great. So both the internal factors and the external factors in Syria were different. And Syria, obviously now, Turkey took a very strong position against the Assad regime. Prime Minister Erdogan took a great risk and openly called for the removal of the regime. Turkey hosted the civilian and, to some extent, the military opposition to the Assad regime, also allowed equipment and all sorts of things that aided the opposition to go through Turkish territory and other parts as well. Now, today, of course, that policy is quite run into problems, as the Assad regime now, with this latest episode with chemical weapons, has now demonstrated again that we have an extremely, I'm not going to say undecided, but very wobbly international scene. The United States, the UK, France is probably one of the more forthcoming ones, but in the end, a coalition of the willing or an adequate number of countries that would want to intervene and take the risk of the day after in Syria has not come about. And I think we will continue to live with the fact that, at least for the coming month, that the Assad regime will be in place. Now, the reason for that is, of course, that the alternative to the Assad regime is no one is able to describe, guarantee, or to some extent predict what would come after, and therefore the current situation seems to be, despite the horrific and barbaric violence that had 110,000 people killed and close to 7 million people displaced, 2 million of those outside the country. Turkey has about 500,000 of refugees on its own territory, and it's a huge burden now on our southern border as well. I think from the Arab Spring, what needs to be registered in my view, and I'm not a Middle East specialist, I look at it from a Turkish foreign policy perspective, is that the initial enthusiasm about a liberal wave or a reawakening of Arab peoples for a better order, for dignity, for good governance, I think will be, if at all, a much longer process than we were expecting. Most of us, especially people in official positions, want these things to happen while they are ministers, ambassadors, or whatever. The fact is, these things are long historical processes with very radical ups and downs, as we are now seeing with the events in Egypt, in Syria, and the Saudi intervention in Bahrain, etc. So if you are on the more optimistic, long-term, somewhat liberal side of things, you could say this is a long-term process, and eventually there will be some sort of new orders emerging that will look better than how it started out. If you're more on the pessimistic side, you could say this is going to produce long-term instability, where the fight for identity, for the role of religion in Muslim societies, how to establish orders that resemble some sort of secular order as elsewhere, is going to be dividing, even perhaps causing the collapse of states. I think today what we call Syria is no longer as solid a political unit as we have come to accustom to. It looks very fragile. Maybe there will never be a Syria again. I actually equally think about Iraq. Iraq is also equally fragile. So you see, Shlomo, you wrote about this in Project Syndicate. It was a great piece. If you're interested in the region, you should read it. You see, I think, a crumbling of the Sykes-Picot order And I think that will create immense pressures on countries like Turkey, Israel, Jordan, and others. There's most likely going to be much more instability ahead of us. Another component of all these things happening is the fight between sects, but also the fight for identity, as we've seen in Egypt, now we see in Turkey, and many other places. And also, I think the debate between majoritarianism versus pluralism. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood won legitimately the elections in Egypt. Unfortunately, the coup has removed that government. I wish there could have been democratic patience enough for a new election where most likely the Brotherhood would have lost significantly its support, and especially if voters' participation would have increased by Egyptians, perhaps even lose the elections. But I think if the democratic processes would have been allowed to take place normally, I think in the long run it would have been resulted in much more stability and probably more progress from a democratic perspective within these societies. I will stop in one sentence. Let me just conclude. I mean, no one has a crystal ball, and I don't either. It's very difficult to predict where these things are heading. But let me conclude with Karel's first question, whether Turkey is a model. Turkey is not in the business of presenting itself as a model. Turkey does not want to be a model. If other countries find certain aspects of the Turkish model attractive and appealing, that's something we would be proud of. But Turkey is not in the business of going around and telling others how to run their countries. And lastly, let me tell you that when I say we, this government ventured into the Middle East, it was a much more stable, predictable Middle East. There was a bit of romanticism on the Turkish side as well, especially among conservative Turks. There was a perception that there was a Middle East out there that was waiting for us to come back, that was warm and welcome, etc. I think with 2009, the Iranian election, then the Arab awakening, I think now Turkey has rudely awakened to the realities of the Middle East. And I think it has already started an adjustment of perceptions and policy calibration towards the region. And I think we will continue to see further calibration of that towards the region in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suat. I knew we'd get to Syria at some point or another. You pulled us right in, and thank you for that. You gave us a little background as to what happened in Egypt and Tunisia and why it was different from Syria, namely that the military and the bureaucracy stood up against the old regime, which did not happen in Syria. And you pointed out how mixed up the international community is today, with one fear, perhaps, if I read you correctly, predominating, and that is the fear of the day after. What happens then? What you did not do is remind us, or rather only indirectly did you remind us of the famous dictum of the famous great American baseball player and philosopher Yogi Berra, who argued that forecasting is difficult, especially when it concerns the future. So you also very soberly pointed out that there is, on the one hand, enthusiasm about the liberal way overcoming, but that it will last longer than many people anticipate. And the question is, will the developments be for the better, sort of a stable, democratic process, however long it may last, or are we going to end up in instability and fragility? One could add failed states and so forth on the way. And finally, you concluded with the Turkish position that it is awakening to the realities of the Middle East, and maybe some of the romantic some of the romantic feelings with which Turkey anticipated its relationship with a number of those countries has been fading. I'm not quoting you directly, but that's the sense that I got. Can I ask Hynek to not necessarily sum up, but give us your reactions to all of this, none of which ought to be new to you. And as I said, a preview of your advice to the President.
Okay, thank you. So my advice to the President will be that there is nothing substantially new, but that it confirms what is observed by the Czech diplomacy in the last one or 2 years. First of all, there is quite good thing for the Israeli-Palestinian track that it became almost invisible. After the first leaks from the negotiations, everything went back when it belongs, which means to the negotiating room. And I agree with Efraim Halevy that suddenly it's not a conflict #1 battle of all the battles. And it could actually help to the Israeli-Palestinian track, because I believe that many times it was the hostage of the media attention which it attracted, and everybody who was ever involved in whatever negotiations that sensitive will confirm you that the worst thing you can meet on your path is a journalist. These are the people to be invited at the end of the negotiations, and if they become involved in the process, it's usually harming. So I would say that I would like to believe that Munib Masri is correct, that this time it will produce something, because in a way it is a historical experience. Probably first time in last decade Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the headline, and it's very much helping to the actual secret stuff which is negotiating. My second advice will follow on many colors of the Arab Spring, because all the discussions about the Arab Spring goes back to the basic Orientalist suspicion which is in the question, and is democracy possible in the Middle East? Our response is yes, democracy is possible, but as Masaryk said, after not so much dictatorship, but authoritarian Austrian Habsburg monarchy collapsed, it takes at least 2 generations to create something like a culture of democracy. So there is no reason why it should be quicker in Egypt, in Syria, in Tunisia, wherever over Middle East. The problem is that we will have to accept probably that what will be democracy will not be the Western type of democracy. I'm constantly struggling with our Western's definitions, that they cover a little bit different field that sometimes people in the area live in. Simply, we say the political party, and we do not exactly expect that one tribe will be called political party with the sheikh of the tribe called chairman of that party. But if we are ready to accept these local colors of the democracy, through the period we will be getting to the democratic regimes all over the Middle East, but none of them will be democratic in the, I would say, 100% Western sense. You simply cannot create Switzerland from Lebanon. Sorry, you cannot, and it's just one of the examples. What is looming over us is, of course, Syria as one of the topics where I expect the discussion will be focused on. The main fear is if Syrian civil war has the tendency to spread out of Syria. And my answer would be that unfortunately it has this tendency because it became a classical proxy war. Practically everybody in the Syrian battlefield has some international sponsor who is showing his own muscles through his own supported community there. And Syria is simply not about the Syria only, and we will be surprised when many people who are participating in the civil war will come back home. And home, I mean to the Netherlands, to Belgium, to Czech Republic. The last advice which I will be giving to the Czech president is that a lot of the questions of the democracy and the development in the Middle East is connected with the basic question, what will happen in the future with the Muslim Brotherhood in different countries under the different names? Simply, what is the political future of the Muslim Brotherhood? And there I would say that the future of the Muslim Brotherhood is called mutation. They will have to mutate into a much larger number of the political parties, and the more the problem of the Muslim Brotherhood, in my opinion, is that basically you cannot make a political compromise with God, because it means you are equal. So the moment you start making political compromises, you lose the purity. The moment you lose the purity, you are not Muslim Brotherhood, you are the political party which came out of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood, in all its mutations, in my opinion, will be mother of all the parties we will be grappling in the future with. And at the same time, they will have their ups and downs, as Egypt showed exactly. That given the appeal of their ideas, they will have, even in the future, the tendency to go up, even in the democratic elections in the Middle East. And once they get to the power, they will show the classical problem of these movements. They have a lot of ideas and almost none on economy. And whatever regime you live in, it's at the end about the delivery. I have never seen any real brother with any really working economic theory. So at the end, once Muslim Brotherhood and under different names is in power, it usually has its ups and downs, ups political and then economically down. So overall, that would be my advice to the Czech president, and of course I will not forget the advice from Bahrain that whatever he wants to do with the Czech foreign policy in the Middle East, hurry up, because in Bahrain they know everything is a matter of time.
Dear Mr. President, Hynek Kmoníček has... Dear Mr. President, Hynek Kmoníček has 4 pieces of advice for you. Number 1, he points out that the Israeli-Palestinian track is invisible, which is good. Number 2, he remarks on the many colors of the Arab Spring and on the many faces of democracy. Number 3, he points out that in Syria, what is being waged is a proxy war with a bunch of other countries being involved. And number 4, he points out that many Middle Eastern questions are connected with the Muslim Brotherhood in its different and mutating guises, and to them he would point out President Clinton's second-term slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." Thank you. We have, I don't know whether they've given us the extra 5 minutes, which I hope they have. If they have, we've got 40 minutes for questions and answers. I also am not sure whether we have a roving microphone, and if so, where it is. We do have at least 1 roving microphone, 2 roving microphones. Now we need some roving questions. Who's interested in raising a hand? Number 1 right here.
Hello, my name is Michal Pečeňa. I study here in Prague, and I have a question for Ms. Nada regarding Bahrain. I remember 2 years ago I signed a petition which led to boycotting of the Formula 1 car race in Bahrain. Do actions of this kind have any resonance whatsoever inside Bahrain, or is it just this Western thing which we think matters but doesn't actually matter? And the following question is, what can I do as a Western citizen to foster civil society in the Gulf? Can I do anything which has any impact? Thank you.
Can you believe this is a really difficult question? In human rights, it should matter. It really should matter and should create some sort of pressure. And keep doing this, it's okay. But I mean, this is the right thing to do. But in my part of the world, the monarchies are so immune that this kind of international pressure doesn't really affect them. So about Formula 1, about the race, it's all business, it's all economy, it's all. This is not the key factor that's going to change or put any sort of pressure on these monarchies to change the way they deal with the people. What's going to change is that you're the people. You put pressure on your parliaments, on your governments to change its foreign policy. That's important. Well, plus these things, it's good to increase the awareness, people aware of that, and of course it goes to the second level of a governmental sector, or whatever.
And what Nada was going to say, thank you for signing that. Mr. Masri has a comment before we go to further questions.
To help Mr. Hynek, fourth advice to the President, if I may, is to stand behind what Mr. Kerry is doing, to encourage the process, and to invite, I hope you could invite the Israelis and Palestinians to sign for a long-lasting peace treaty in Prague, because I think Prague could be an example for this. Please encourage him to do that.
If you have the treaty, you are invited.
No, we want you to help to make the treaty. This is what I said. The advice is not to sit aside and watch, and is not the process is very difficult, but it's doable. If you urge the European countries, and you are one of them, is to stand behind what it's doing and to encourage Mr. Kerry, I think we have a very good opportunity to do that. Please do it. Thank you.
Right. I have the young lady here, then the gentleman all the way in the back, and then the gentleman all the way to my right. Okay, the young lady here halfway down the aisle.
Hello. Last Friday we had an important anniversary.
And would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Anna Zamets, and I'm social media manager for Project Syndicate. Last Friday we had a very important anniversary. It was 20 years since the Oslo Accords were signed. I would like to direct my question to Mr. Halevy and Mr. Masri at the same time. So what appeared to be the greatest hope for peace in the Middle East turned into the greatest disappointment 20 years later. I'd like to ask you, why do you think the Oslo agreements failed? Who is to blame for that? And whether the current structure of the Oslo Accords, meaning the Palestinian autonomy, can still serve as a basis for future negotiations. Thank you.
Efraim, want to take that one? And
maybe Mr. Masri first.
No, Mr. Masri. Let me learn from you. I want to learn from you. Always put me on this. I want to learn from you.
For those who didn't understand, this is the second time we're meeting here today in such a forum, so you see we're making progress. The Oslo Accords are in the eyes of the beholder. And even those who detract the Oslo Accords, who did not support them at the time, have to admit that the Oslo Accords actually brought a major change in the equation between Israel and the Palestinians. Israel brought back the Palestinian leadership and handed over territory to the Palestinian leadership and authority to the Palestinian leadership. And there was a Palestinian authority, which is there till this day. I could spend a lot of time explaining why I believe that the Palestinian Authority didn't make the progress that it was hoping to make, and also why Israel, on the other hand, to some extent was disappointed by the way the Palestinians performed after they received the authority that they received. But I would like to look from now to the future. And I think that what has happened over the last 20 years has been a growing realization on both sides that neither side can attain the ultimate of its dreams. There is a growing understanding that both on the Palestinian divide and on the Israeli divide, that none of us will be able to get what we ultimately would have liked to have got. And therefore, there will have to be what we call a historic compromise. But because of the events of the last 20 years, which have affected both sides in the way they have been affected, two things have happened. One is that neither leader of either Israel or the Palestinian Authority has the capability to implement a permanent solution between the two sides. The Palestinian Authority is split not only ideologically, but also geographically. And Mr. Abu Mazen does not control a serious part of the Palestinian Authority, and that is Gaza. And therefore, there is a problem on the Palestinian side. And there is also a problem on the Israeli side. Because even if we assume, as I think we can begin to assume, that the present leader of Israel wants to achieve an agreement, I think his capability of enforcing a permanent agreement is to some extent unrealistic because of the domestic situation in Israel. And therefore you find a situation in which the leadership on both sides have their serious problems in exercising their ultimate leadership. And because of that, I do not want to second guess what will be the result of the negotiation and whether there will or will not be an agreement for a permanent settlement. I don't know. And I'll let you all into a secret in this room. I think nobody knows, including the negotiators, whether they really have a chance to obtain a permanent negotiation within 9 months, by the way. But even if they do, and if a miracle happens, in the last few years in the Middle East, miracles have been a daily occurrence, as you've probably seen. You've seen leaderships have risen and fallen, regimes have risen and fallen. We are now roller coasting all the time, and we really don't have a grip on the events. But even if there is an ultimate permanent agreement, the implementation of such an agreement will not be able to take place unless there are steps towards the implementation, which means to say that we will have to go step by step, and we'll have to be patient with each other step by step as we walk the line. Right. There is one last sad thing I want to say. We have a problem, in my view, concerning the Palestinian leadership, because we don't see the succession of leaderships, and we don't see who might come after. We know Mr. Abu Mazen is the leader, but the system in the Palestinian side is such that we cannot find out and we cannot finger people and say this or that person might be the person to take over. On the Israeli side, on the other hand, we have a multitude of candidates for the leadership. There are at least 1 million Israelis who think they can become Prime Minister of Israel. And some of them think it even seriously. So the system is different and the situation is different. I don't know how we can overcome that, but I'm sure Mr. Al-Masri will be able to help us to understand how this will come about on the Palestinian side. Thank you.
So there's your challenge.
Mr. Halevy said he doesn't see any succession on the Palestinian side. I wish, as long as you think this way, we will never have a settlement. How would you decide? I never dare to ask you how is to succeed in Israel. This is your problem. That thing is our problem. We'll find a successor. I will tell you, we will find, after Arafat, we find Abu Mazen, and after Abu Mazen, we'll find the successor, the right successor. Don't worry about it. We shall, no, don't worry about it. We will find them. We'll find a good one. Believe me, we'll find a good one. But that's as long as the Israelis think this way, we will never have a settlement. Believe me. And after the meeting, you and I, we're going to have a meeting anyway, and I will tell you how we're going to do it, with your help. But don't interfere with us to say, do this and do that and do that. We have enough of occupation. We want freedom. We want our freedom. Mr. Halevy, I want my dignity. Stop talking about me. Let me talk about myself. Oslo, thank you for bringing Oslo. I was part of Oslo. I supported Oslo. I want to see the Palestinians love the Israelis. So we came to Oslo and we said, we took all the sacrifices we want to take. Instead of 100% in our mind of Palestine, historical Palestine, our leader accepted 22%. United Nations gave us 46%, but we accepted 22% to say we want to live together with our cousins, with the Israelis. But this didn't happen. And Mr. Halevy put all the blame on us. I will say Oslo was signed in 1993. In 1999, we have supposed to sit down and talk about final solution to the thing. Unfortunately, this didn't happen because Israel said, no, you cannot do this, you cannot do that. You cannot talk about final status, you cannot talk about Jerusalem, you cannot talk about refugees, you cannot talk about water. So it froze it all. There was a great leader in Israel called Mr. Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin. He did it, he made the decision. He and Arafat were great leaders, and they signed on the peace treaty, and they wanted to see a two-state solution. Both were killed. Mr. Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by an Israeli who came from Yemen. And I don't know if lots of Palestinians think that probably Arafat was murdered, but we don't know who killed him. But a lot of Palestinians blame the Israelis that they put poison in his food. We don't know yet. I think soon we will know. So those two leaders, Israel is not ready yet to make a peace treaty. Whenever they are ready, we are ready. We gave the sacrifices. We agreed. Oslo was a great thing. I don't want to prolong this thing. I don't want to bring the feeling of pre-Oslo, where hatred was there. Oslo came and wiped completely all the hatred from our hearts. We said we want to open a new page, and I agree with Mr. Halevy. I want to open a new page. But as long as Israelis are not ready yet, we cannot have it. I ask everybody to encourage the Israelis, make peace. The reward of peace is greater than what you have. Don't have all the cake and eat it. This cake have to split 22%. What Arafat have asked for, nobody, any Palestinians who's coming from now until eternity will accept any less than 22%. He will not accept any less than East Jerusalem as its capital. And what the Arab Peace Initiative provided to the Israelis, that 57 Arab and Islamic states will recognize the state of Israel, will normalize complete commercial relation with them. So it's an offer they cannot refuse. This is the Arabs, the Arab League and Islamic League have given this to Israel. It's an opportunity, and I will ask all of you to encourage your Israeli friends or any contact you have, go do it because the reward is there. I, for myself and my children and my family, been working for 40 years to be living in peace with Israel. Till now, I cannot find it from the Israeli side. I asked Mr. Halevy to really work hard. We are ready for you. We want to live with you. We want to love you. We want to be partner with you. But first, please consider us as equals to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We won't continue in this particular dialogue because Mr. Halevy and Mr. Masri are going to have coffee over it. Yes. And they will make progress and tell us. Right. I've got your report. Brilliant. I had a question over there in the very back row. Then I have a question over there on the right. And then I have the question of the gentleman in the red shirt.
Good afternoon. Martin Weiser, Czech News Agency. So maybe to diffuse the Israeli-Palestinian tension, I would like to go back to Syria, if we can. and ask Mr. Kmoníček, you mentioned the foreign fighters in the Syrian war, and you even mentioned the Czech Republic in this regard. So do you have any information about the possible involvement of Czech citizens in the Syrian war, or is it something you expect? Thank you.
No, I don't have specific information about the Czech nationals fighting in Syria, but the situation is so non-transparent that even we can be one day surprised. And then remember, we are part of Schengen, and I would not be hesitating to say that they are Schengen nationals already in. Okay?
Right. So let's leave that at that. Less speculation, the better. The gentleman, there was a, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I have two quick questions. One for the
Did
speaker.
you introduce yourself? Or did
Yeah, my name is Jassim. I'm from Bahrain. The question is to the speaker from Turkey. I noticed that you have conveniently overlooked troubles in Taksim, as if nothing has happened really. The issues in Taksim, all the issues in Taksim Square over the last few months. Your thoughts on what happened in Taksim and the reaction of Mr. Erdogan to those who are seeking greater democracy in Turkey.
Can I, before Suat answers, can I just make the point of the moderator that the word conveniently was inconvenient. Suat was not asked about internal Turkish issues. We were talking about Turkey's impact on the Middle East. So it is true, Taksim was not mentioned, which now is a chance, but I would not characterize that as having been a matter of convenience.
Thank you, Karel. Let me give you my take, and there are probably very different takes depending on which Turk you talk about. When you talk about Gezi Park, we call it Gezi Park protests, not Taksim. I was there actually. I checked in a hotel into the Taksim area 2 days before it all started, and actually I had the privilege to see it all with my own eyes. I think a correct description of the Gezi Park protests would be that the middle classes that 10 years of AK government was influential in growing and enlarging have asked for a redefinition and delimitation of their relationship with the individual and the state. I think that is, at least in my view, a relatively acceptable description. It was predominated by secular Turks, I would say maybe 80%, but there were also conservative Turks part of these protests. It started out as an environmental concern about a park, which is actually quite small. If you would see it in reality, you would be surprised about the impact of it. But it's a small park in the center of Istanbul. But it was also a reaction to a decade-long of construction, growing construction projects, Turkish cities becoming increasingly large building blocks with green disappearing. So it started out as an environmental protest, but it turned later into a protest against the government and specifically against the prime minister for what was perceived as intervention into the private lifestyles of citizens. Its impact continues to rattle Turkey, and I mean, the park issue immediately enveloped the country. Out of 81 Turkish provinces, in 79 provinces there were protests. And even today in Istanbul there were protests again in different forms and different groups. I think it's, as they say in American English, the jury is still out on what kind of verdict one should give to the protests. But next March we have local elections in Turkey, which will be extremely crucial. And I think the first impact, if at all, we will see at the ballot box what kind of impact these have. Unfortunately, during these protests, there were some fringe and marginal groups who burned buses, bus stations, and there was some vandalism involved. And I think many conservative voters in Turkey saw the events not as they played out in Istanbul, but more of a sort of fringe, marginal groups trying to disrupt order in big cities. But on the other hand, social media had an enormous impact on the event. The Turkish media chose at the beginning not to show the protests, and therefore was heavily criticized, which then put the whole attention on social media, which, as you know, is easy to manipulate, and there was some not very acceptable occurrences of exaggeration of some of these things. In the event, just to sum up, I look at it as the Turkish middle class making its voice heard on what started out with an environmental issue, but turned into a request and cry for a delimitation of the relationship between the state and the individual. Lastly, it was also a crisis of representation. Turkish opposition parties still are not being able to present election winnable platforms, and I think many of these people were also trying to bring attention to the fact that many citizens are not properly represented in the system. We have a 10% threshold quota in our election system, which does not allow you to be represented in parliament if you have 9% of the vote. So therefore, there was also a crisis of representation involved. But the real impact and the real judgment about what these protests mean, I think, remains to be seen. It's still an ongoing process.
Thank you very much, Suat. The gentleman in the red shirt back there.
Good afternoon. My name is Karen Marai. I'm here with a group of delegates from Libya today. They all represent different civil society organizations from Libya, and they've come to Prague to learn about transitions in Central and Eastern Europe.
Welcome.
Thank you. We have a question from one of the members of the group. He'd like to pose it in Arabic. I'll translate after, and then I would ask the members of the panel who are Arabic speakers to respond in English, and I'll translate into Arabic for him. Thank you.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
طبعا معكم أنا باسط العبيدي من ليبيا. عندي تعقيب بسيط. الأول يعني ما قاله أحد المحاضرين بأن الرئيس السابق مساريكا قال إن العملية الديمقراطية تحتاج لجيلين، يعني سبب لنا إحباط الشيء هذا يعني.
First, I'd like to make a comment related to a previous statement about what President Masri had said about the development of democracy taking 2 generations. This has caused us some depression in Libya, if it's going to take that long.
Welcome to the real world.
سؤالي هو يعني هل ترون بأن قبول إسرائيل لإحياء عملية السلام وإجراء مفاوضات في هذا الوقت كان سببه الربيع العربي؟
And the question is, do you think that Israel's willingness to return to the negotiating table had anything to do with the pressures from the Arab Spring? Thank you.
Is the question directed at any particular of our panelists?
تحب حد معين يرد على السؤال ولا الجميع؟ سيد منيب المصري and Mr. Halevy preferably.
So it's directed at you. Will the pressure of the Arab Spring have any impact on the...
I do not think that the Arab Spring had any effect on the timing of the renewal of the Israel-Palestinian negotiations. I think this is more related to other regional events, like the events in Syria, and also it's related to, from an Israeli, I'm talking about the Israeli point of view. I don't think there was any pressure on us resulting from the Arab Spring. It's other events, such as the event in Syria, and the major issue concerning Iran, which in Israel is considered to be the #1 item on its agenda. It's a strategic agenda at the moment, and therefore the wish to try and solve other issues before the time comes and might come to have to address the Iranian issue outside the diplomatic formula.
مسيك بالخير. I will tell you, my point of view is yes, there is a relation, and I tell you why. In a feeble story, once upon a time, there was a defeat by the Arab armies from Israel in 48 and in 67. So the reason for this defeat, leaders in the Arab world came and made revolution against the kings or presidents of that time. And they stayed in power, doing favors. They became dictators. These leaders who came to liberate Palestine, they became dictators. The price for them to stay was to see that the flow of oil from the countries, producing countries, will stay on, and they will be the stooges of the West. So they became the stooges of the West. Until the people like you and the people like in Egypt and in Tunisia, the people said, what is the hell? We have a corrupted leaders, let's get rid of them. And that's what happened. They get rid of them, and they are very much related, because I'm sure you are probably one of them who decided that enough support for these stooges, we need to get rid of them, we need to see democracy, and we need to see dignity and independence for Palestinians. And if you have differently, please let me know. But I want to tell this to Mr. Halevy, please wake up in Israel, say that we do have a Palestinian question, we have a problem. You and us, we need to do it. We don't want to go to pre-Oslo. We finished the hatred. We want to open a new page. We want to go ahead. We want to have peace, but an honorable peace. Peace of the brave, as Yasser Arafat puts it. Peace of the brave, the peace of Mr. Rabin and Mr. Arafat. Thank you.
Right.
You tell me, is that what you thought or what? Sure.
Okay, I think we understand here
yes.
across the room. I'm looking for further questions. Yes, the lady up front here. Wait for a microphone. Introduce yourself, and put a brisk question.
Hi. Thank you very much for all you shared today. I'm Monica Neubauer from the United States, and my question refers to something that you said and that we heard in the earlier session about some of the falsely created borders of some of the Middle Eastern nations and the possible collapse. And I can't imagine what that might look like, and I wonder if you have any possible idea of what that might look like or how the countries would reform.
Suat, do you want to take that, since you broached the issue of Syria and Iraq probably being, I don't know whether you said artificial, but you know what I mean.
Well, I mean, look, no one can predict how these things will play out. I might be wrong. Maybe, who knows, maybe the international community will shift back and resign to the fact that Assad, the Ba'ath regime, should continue to run the place. They gradually retake territory and the fighters leave or are marginalized or whatever, who knows. But I'm afraid that the unitary state that we call Syria, or the political entity that we know on the map as Iraq, are now very fragile entities. The north of Iraq, where the Kurdistan regional government is de facto acts like a state. I hear from my Iraqi friends that the current government does not control much more than the center of Baghdad. Syria is already a microcosm of the Middle East. There are Christian, Druze, Nusayris, Alevis, whatever. I am afraid, this is not something I aspire to or look forward to. Please don't get me wrong. I'm afraid that reuniting that country will not be possible. And that we, when I say we, all of us, Turks, Europeans, Israelis, etc., will have to grapple with the instability that this de facto situation might produce. What could this look like? This could look like, for a long time, certain areas what we know today as Iraq and Syria, lawlessness, no control, no one to talk to who runs the place. I might be wrong, this might be a very pessimistic interpretation, but I've been to many workshops these days where these things are now increasingly being discussed. And I'm afraid, I hope that those workshops and myself are wrong and that these entities will remain from a simple point of view of order and governance and dealing with entities you can talk to. Because the scenario that I outlined is extremely detrimental to Turkey and will probably mean long-time instability and threat perceptions to our southern border. So, but as I said, it's impossible for me to predict in any way how this could play out. Maybe it will not.
Thank you very much, Suat. I've decided we have space for one more question, if there is one, because they took away some of our minutes at the beginning. Inasmuch as I don't see any hands up, please help me thank our panelists for a fascinating beginning of the afternoon. On the one hand, there's another session continuing here concerning the Middle East, in which at least Nada is participating, of the people around this desk, I think. On the other hand, we will be waiting for a report from the coffee that Mr. Halevy and Mr. Masri are going to have together. Thank you all very much for your active participation.